Hey everybody, it's D from D&D Ditches, and today the D stands for Dilly Dally because it's taken me way too long to get this video out. This will be part 2 of my showcase on all Planescape supplements released during the 2nd edition era. If you missed part 1, click here. So as I mentioned in my previous video, I have divided the 12 supplements released for Planescape into 4 groups of 3 books each. So previously I've already covered the Monstrous Compendium Trilogy and the Sigil Trilogy. So in this book, the 6 books that I will be covering are Planar Expansion Trilogy, which consists of a guide to the Astral Plane, a guide to the Ethereal Plane, and the Inner Planes. And then we have the 3 miscellaneous lore expansion supplements, which are the Planewalkers Handbook, On Hallowed Ground, and Faces of Evil, the Fiends. So let's get started. Before we start, just going to say that this playmat featuring the Githyanki Warrior is going to be on theme because we are checking out the Planar Expansion Trilogy of supplements. The first book being a guide to the Astral Plane, which is oddly appropriate because that's where the Githyanki have chosen to make their home. So at this point, all of the outer planes, also known as the Great Wheel, has already been expanded upon in its related products. So these 3 supplements offer expansions to the remaining planes that have not yet been covered. A guide to the Astral Plane was published in October 1996. A guide to the Ethereal Plane was published in May 1998. And the Inner Planes was published in November 1998. It was literally the last product that was published under the Planescape banner by TSR. As by 1998, TSR has already been acquired by Wizards of the Coast, and allegedly Wizards of the Coast wanted to cut some of the campaign settings because they realized that TSR's business model was not working, and the Planescape line was cancelled at that point. We saw a handful of Planar related content after this book, and also Planescape Torment, the computer game, but after this point the Planescape campaign setting was no longer supported. So the contents described in these books are quite literally on its cover. The Astral Plane is a transitive plane between the outer planes and the prime material plane, with the prime material plane referring to most of the standard fantasy setting worlds such as Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, and the outer planes refer to the Great Wheel cosmology. The ethereal plane is a transitive plane between the inner planes and prime material plane. The ethereal plane does not touch the outer planes, and the astral plane does not touch the inner planes. The only place where the ethereal touches the astral is the prime material plane. These distinctions have implications when it comes to planar travel methods, as well as certain spells or magic items. For example, canonically, when you are on one of the outer planes, any spells which requires the ethereal plane which cease to function. However, most DMs these days will try to work around that. And what are the inner planes, you ask? The inner planes are the raw building materials of the multiverse, and they're also known as the elemental planes. Modern edition D&D players may be more familiar with the term elemental chaos or the astral sea. Now, both of these terms were created during 4th edition that got carried over into 5th. You might be asking, what about the Far Realm, or the Feywild, or the Shadowfell? Far Realm was created during 2nd edition, but it was developed independently to Planescape. It was created in a module called something to, I think, the Firestorm Peak or something like that. And it was actually written by Bruce Cordell. This Bruce Cordell. Feywild and Shadowfell were both created during 4th edition and was carried over into the 5th. It's worth noting that the 4E planar cosmology was very different to the Great Wheel cosmology from Planescape. So that's enough talk on planar cosmology. Let's have a look at the first book. So first up, we have a guide to the Astral Plane. This book is 96 pages. So the first time that I read this book was after all of the Planes of X box sets, and I was not looking forward to this book because, it's just the Astral Plane, nothing's there. But this book ended up being very entertaining because it introduced a lot of new ideas. I'm sure anybody who has played Baldur's Gate 3 has a pretty good idea of what the Astral Plane is about because the Astral was featured quite heavily on Baldur's Gate 3. But what is the Astral Plane anyway? So the first few pages provide you with an explanation on what the Astral Plane is. So how I understand it is that the Astral Plane is the space between the space. That doesn't make much sense, right? So imagine two buildings being built right against each other. Anybody who lives in a city should know what I mean. So if you imagine one of these buildings being the prime material and the other being the outer plane, and you may have the teeniest bit of gap between the two that you might be able to slip through a piece of paper. Now that is the astral plane. You're not supposed to be able to get there physically, but there are ways to do so. As the outer planes are the planes of belief where the gods reside, and as you know, gods rely on the worship of its mortal followers, most of whom live on the prime material plane, there are astral conduits which carry the thoughts and prayers between the worshippers and their gods, and vice versa. Think of these conduits like phone cords. A more modern interpretation of the astral plane would be likening it to cyberspace. It is an imaginary space for the purpose of the exchange of information. Given that the astral plane is a theoretical space, it also has unusual physical properties, such as time being halted. Except there's no gravity in the astral, so you should not have been able to jump from one platform to the next like you're on the moon. As the astral plane is the plane of thought, movement in the astral is accomplished by thinking. And while on the astral, your strength and dexterity scores are replaced by intelligence and wisdom respectively. So spellcasters generally love taking the astral for a spin. Marshals, not so much. Being able to fight while floating in astral space means that you're able to be flanked by more combatants than normal. Then it goes on to talk about astral magic. As mentioned earlier, anything that requires a connection to the ethereal plane will not function. The next section talks about astral conduits. The conduits can be used for planar travel as well to connect from the prime material to the outer plane. And the next section talks about the astral color pools. This is another method for planar travel as the color pools are unique to the astral plane. Each of the outer plane has a unique color. And by carefully discerning the color, you may be able to figure out which plane it leads to before diving in. Then we get a few pages on dead gods. Gods who lose their followers end up as husks floating in the astral plane, although they don't exactly die, more like in hibernation, as it is possible to resurrect a dead god. Throughout the history of D&D, there's been gods who died and came back. Planescape even has an adventure module called Dead Gods. Then it talks about the hazards, psychic winds, or really more like hurricanes. And then we come to the largest part of this book, devoted to the Githyanki. This is also the best section of the book as we have artwork by Tony DiTerlizzi again. For anybody who played Baldur's Gate 3, I can tell you that the lore that was depicted on Githyanki in the game were all correct. Even down to the words like Kithrak, meaning the captain. And then of course the Lich Queen Vlaakith herself. And then describes Githyanki cities. Tunarath, mentioned by Lae'zel from Baldur's Gate 3, is also the largest city. So overall, I was really impressed with the designers of Baldur's Gate 3 getting all of their planar lore essentially correct. All of its lore, from being enslaved by the Illithids, to the warrior Gith, what happened with the Red Dragon, the disagreement with Zerthamon leading to the creation of the Githzerai, and everything relating to Vlaakith were bang on. The only part that was created purely for the game was anything related to Orpheus. Although I did like what they did with him, as it's only taken almost 30 years to get an expansion on Githyanki lore. And then we have the Githyanki finally being a playable race. Then we move on to the creatures that live on the astral, which is not that many, with the Githyanki still being the most likely creature to be encountered on this plane. And then we finish off the book with some of the locations that exist on the astral, such as the Aether Citadel, and a few other locations. And that's it for this book. Let's move on to the next one. Next up, let's take a look at a guide to the ethereal plane. This book is also 96 pages, and it's written similarly to a guide to the astral plane. Just to give you guys some context, Planescape did not invent or create new planes except for maybe the secondary and tertiary elemental planes. Essentially, all of the outer planes, the inner planes, the ethereal, and the astral already existed from prior editions. Planescape merely organized it and created a cosmology map to explain how the planes are related to each other. So in prior editions, you already had spells and magic items which involve the astral or the ethereal, for example astral spell and oil of etherealness, but it was still very vague as to how these planes function. So the writers of Planescape collated all the previous times where the astral or the ethereal were mentioned and tried to fit all of this information into a cohesive canon. It worked fairly well for the astral plane, but when it came to the ethereal plane, it's a bit of a mess. Let's give this book a bit of a flip through. So the first few pages were spent on trying to explain the ethereal plane, and then you have the subsequent 2 chapters breaking down the border ethereal and the deep ethereal. And this is the part that gets really confusing. So what is the ethereal plane? And the name of this introduction chapter is called The Shape of the Waveless Sea. They tend to use a lot of nautical references when describing the ethereal. The plane is sometimes described as the misty realm. They use the metaphor of standing on the seashore to describe the border ethereal. The idea being, when you're in the border ethereal, you're actually in both the ethereal and the prime material plane at the same time. And hence the seashore metaphor is supposed to describe how you are able to have your feet in the water, but still able to see on the land. And then they use the metaphor of going into the depth of the ocean as traveling into the deep ethereal. Now I have a bone to pick with this metaphor because it implies that traveling into the ethereal consists of 3-dimensional movement. But the actual fact is, at least how I understand it, is that traveling into the ethereal is more like moving into the 4th dimension. And that is because the prime material plane and the ethereal are essentially stacked on top of each other and occupy the same 3-dimensional space. So take a look at this piece of artwork. I used to read a lot of X-Men comics when I was younger, and I consider etherealness being similar to Kitty Pryde or Shadowcat's mutant ability to phase out of existence. Like this piece of artwork shows, the character on the left is reaching her hand towards the character on the right, but her hand slipped right through their body as if she was incorporeal. Note that back in 2e, the undead ghost monster is also said to exist in the ethereal plane, and that's the reason why they're incorporeal and able to become invisible. The term phased were also used to describe etherealness at times, such as the monster phase spiders. And when someone uses the oil of etherealness, they're also said to be transported to the ethereal plane. However, in all of the above cases, they're merely in the border ethereal. While on the border ethereal, a creature is able to see into the prime material plane like a ghost, but they're not able to be touched or interacted with by anything on the prime material plane, except for things like magical weapons. Creatures in the prime material plane are not able to see any creatures in the border ethereal unless they possess the ability to see into ethereal. So the book describes the process of moving from the border ethereal to the deep ethereal as simply willing it. So once again, this implies the ethereal plane overlaps the prime material plane, and the overlap section is considered border ethereal. At least that's my take on it. Speaking of ethereal's relation to the other planes, we have a diagram. So on the right side, we have prime material worlds encased in its own crystal spheres floating in the phlogiston. But the diagram shows that each of the prime material worlds are encased in border ethereal, which then leads to the deep ethereal. Once again, this diagram implies a 3-dimensional movement to get into the ethereal, which is not very correct and very confusing. But within the deep ethereal, we have the elemental planes, also known as the inner planes. We'll talk more about that on the next book, but what else is floating in the deep ethereal are demiplanes. So the difference between planes and demiplanes is that planes are infinite, whereas demiplanes are finite. We'll talk a bit more about demiplanes in a sec. Let's see what else is contained in the deep ethereal. So the walls of color are similar to the color pools of the astral, in that they lead into any of the planes or demiplanes bordered by the ethereal, such as the elemental planes. The ethereal also tend to have an affinity for time, and then it talks about hazards and protomatter. While the astral plane is considered the plane of thought, the ethereal plane is the plane of matter, as it connects the prime material plane to the elemental planes, also known as the building blocks of the multiverse. So occasionally the mists in the ethereal plane solidifies enough and creates protomatter, and it can be used to create things. For example, this part talks about illusions can be made solid with the help of protomatter. Then it goes on to talk about spells and magical conditions, and provides several new spells, and talks about how demiplanes are formed, and provides a list of the known demiplanes. Some of the best known ones are the demiplanes of Dread, also known as Ravenloft. Remember guys, back in 2e the Shadowfell did not exist. And then we also had the demiplane of Shadow, which in later editions simply refer to as the plane of Shadow. And then we have the demiplane of Time, and the Lady of Pain's mazes are considered part of the ethereal plane also. We also get a small section on dreams. The reason why this section exists is because there was a Ravenloft box set called the Nightmare Lands, and they wanted to cross-promote, so it just boils down to buy the Nightmare Lands if you want to know more about it. And then we get a section about the monsters and creatures that inhabit the ethereal plane. Most of these monsters already exist in the Monstrous Manual or the Monstrous Compendium Appendix 3, and in the last chapter we finally get some locations where we can go adventure in. So between a guide to the ethereal plane and a guide to the astral plane, I much prefer the astral plane, as it gave us a large section on Githyanki lore, whereas the ethereal plane is largely uninhibited. And we can move on to the next book. Now we come to the last book of this trilogy called The Inner Planes. Cover art's done by the legendary Brom, who did the art for the Dark Sun setting. The book is 128 pages. It seemed like a very limited number of these were printed given this was the last Planescape release, as this book seemed to go for insane prices on eBay. The Inner Planes were also known as the Elemental Planes back in 2nd edition, although these days the term Elemental Chaos is more popular, given this was the Planar cosmology term used from 4th edition onwards. Back in the day, the Elemental Planes were less chaotic, as the Elemental Planes were laid out in a formation that was both symmetrical and cohesive. Apart from the standard Earth, Air, Fire, and Water, you also had positive and negative energy. If you think of the collective inner planes in a spherical formation, these 6 primary elemental planes would form the X, Y, and Z axes in 3 dimensions. In a future video, I want to demonstrate the formation of the inner planes on a sphere, so make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss out. And while you're at it, give me a thumb up and let me know in the comments what future content you would like me to cover. Apart from the primary elemental planes, there are 4 secondary para-elemental planes which forms between the 4 basic elements. And then we have 8 tertiary quasi-elemental planes which are formed when one of the basic elements meets positive or negative energy. If you've been doing the maths, that is 18 planes that are considered the inner planes. If we turn over to the table of contents, you'll see that each of the 18 planes will get its own chapter. And this diagram demonstrates where the planes lie in relation to each other. We have a few pages of introduction, and we're introduced to certain concepts like elemental pockets. It is not unusual to find pockets of elemental matter from a neighboring plane. And then we dive right into the first of the elemental planes, the plane of air. So we're given the same setup for each of these planes. First of all, it talks about how to get there and the environmental hazards. Given these planes all contain little but the element of the plane is named after, the conditions are generally incredibly hostile to most player characters. Then we're given a section about the inhabitants of the plane. The plane of air is the least hostile of the inner planes, so you tend to find a lot more inhabitants here than anywhere else on the inner planes. The typical elemental plane inhabitants consist of elementals, and there are a handful of powers that reside on these planes, most typically elemental princes and genie deities. And then the book gives us 2 or 3 sites, which may be cities or other places of interest. And then the same formula is carried out for the other planes. The city of brass from the plane of fire gets a feature. Now it's worth noting that on the planes, people don't say the elemental plane of fire or the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum. Instead, they'll just say fire with a capital F. It's a bit like in real life how we don't use the official titles of the countries. For example, the Commonwealth of Australia or the Republic of Ireland. Instead, we just say Australia with a capital A and Ireland with a capital I. So by going around the planes and asking questions like, which way is to the elemental plane of fire, will just make you look like a clueless, also known as somebody from the prime material plane. The write-ups get a little bit more interesting when we move into the para-elemental and the quasi-elemental planes, as now we're getting introduced to the border territory diagrams. Each para-elemental and quasi-elemental plane is surrounded by 6 neighboring planes. Each of the border territories are given its own names, such as the obsidian forest between magma and mineral, the glowing dunes between magma and radiance, the searing mist between magma and fire, and so on and so forth. These represents the physical conditions as one elemental plane transitions to another, and creates a bordered territory where the 2 elemental forces meet. And sometimes there are interesting sites located in these border territories. For example, we have Ulan's laboratory located in the Chalk Islands between ash and magma, and Targus Tower located in the scorched waste between the magma and earth. It is through these border territories that we're introduced to the concept of bordered infinities, because remember, the planes are infinite, but the borders are not. Some fans would even consider these border territories to be pseudo-planes of themselves. Unfortunately, this book is only 128 pages long, and it needs to cover 18 planes as it is, and most planes are given between 4 to 6 pages worth of write-up. And these border territories are only given about a paragraph worth of write-up, so it's going to take some effort and creativity from the DM to make these areas feel distinct, if you wish to use them. And on top of that, the new sites being introduced are given less than a quarter of a page of descriptions. So this formula will continue for the remainder of this book. And on the last couple of pages, we have an index of all the inner planar monsters and creatures and which book they appear in. And some of these planes have very little creature variety. For example, the plane of Ooze, you've got the Dahl, the Merid, Ooze Method, Ooze Para-Elemental, and Ooze Sprite, and that's it. So with this book, we have now covered each and every single one of the planes from Planescape. And we move on to the last set of the supplements. We have 3 supplements remaining. Now these 3 books don't have a common theme, so I will talk about them individually. I will call these supplements the lore expansion books. So we're going to take a look at the Planewalkers Handbook, released in August 1996. It is 160 pages. If you speak to any 2E Planescape fan, chances are they will say that this book is their favorite. About 12 or 13 years ago, I used to have a web page saved in my bookmarks, which was a bit like the Metacritics of the AD&D 2 ebooks. And I think how it worked was that each user could score a book and give it a rating out of 10. And then the site would give an average aggregate score of each of the books. And this book, as I remember, scored the highest of not just the Planescape books, but all of 2nd edition. And I think it came in at something like 9.8. or something ridiculous like that. And if I remember correctly, Planescape held 5 of the top 10 positions on that site, because I remember boasting about it to people. But of course that link no longer works, so you can just take that as the rambling of an old man. So I've spoken about how every single other Planescape product was designed to be predominantly used by the DM. This is a handbook written for the players. So back in 2nd edition, TSR had this great idea of releasing a line of books targeted towards the players, and each of these handbooks covered a separate player character class. I have a copy of the complete Psionics handbook here. Every single player character class got its own handbook, so the fighters, paladins, rangers, wizards, you name it. And then they also expanded to racial handbooks such as the complete elves, dwarves, halflings, so on and so forth. So these books actually sold really well because there was an incentive for every single player to purchase the handbook for their own class. Hence they tried to duplicate this formula, with Spelljammer, Alkadim, and Darksun all receiving a player's handbook supplement. And this is the Planescape's version. So let's have a look at the interior of this book. So this book talks about a little bit of everything. We start with the different planes, some tips on how to get around, talks about the factions, new player options, and then we have some new material towards the end of the book. This book introduces Tashiva Longreach. She is an experienced planewalker, and the Planewalkers Handbook is the in-universe book that she wrote. So once more, we're introduced to the planes, but this book is written from the player's perspective. This image of the planes is quite famous. You might have seen it yourself, just because it's quite detailed in how it breaks up the planes and its layers. Each of the plane gets about a half a page worth of write-up, and at the end of each plane, Tashiva herself gives her recommendation on something to see or do in that plane, or just tips to how to stay alive. So the next chapter moves on to planar travel and breaks down the different types of portals and other planar gateways. This image does a great job on explaining how portals work. So most of this information is not new, it's just written to be more concise and clearer for the benefit of the players. Then we get a small chapter on the Planewalker tips. It gives tips on what arsenal each class has available to them and how they can contribute towards traveling the planes, and also dealing with others in regards to role-playing. And the next section talks about the factions. Given that this is a book written for the players, this could actually be the first time players are exposed to the factions of Sigil. It gives the player a crash course on the factions, but what is useful is towards the end of this section you have factions at a glance, and at the end of each section it gives you 2 or 3 archetypes for each faction, which is really helpful when it comes to role-playing. So as we know, each faction has their own philosophy, however each of the philosophy are actually quite flexible. So each archetype gives you a different facet or different interpretation of that faction philosophy. So for example, for the Revolutionary League, also known as the Anarchists, They believe in tearing down the status quo, which includes all the other factions. So the first archetype given is Rebel without a clue, who needs a reason, riot, loot, and burn it all down. This describes somebody who subscribes to the mindset of wanton destruction. They don't care about who gets hurt or what gets destroyed because all of it goes towards the end goal of spreading anarchy. And then there's an archetype called the Mole. Worm your way into the heart of the power and slowly destroy it from within. This describes somebody who's more calculated and uses subterfuge to get what they want. The next chapter gives us more player options. Planescape previously given us the Barial, the Gizzerai, and the Tiefling as playable races. This book introduces 3 more. First up, we have the upper plane counterpart to the Tiefling, the Arsima. And then we also get the 4 flavors of the Genasi also being introduced in this book. So we have air, earth, water, and fire. And finally, we have the Roe Modron being introduced as a player character race. Normally, Modrons are part of a hive mind and do not have free will. As to them being lawful neutral creatures, order represents perfection. But occasionally something happens to an individual Modron, be it a glitch or being touched by chaos in some way, where they're freed from the matrix and develop sentience. That's what we call a rogue Modron. They're considered an abomination by the hive-minded Modrons and generally hunted down and destroyed. Then we get some gorgeous art depicting 2 Tieflings who are very different from each other. And I mentioned in my previous videos how Tieflings used to be a lot more diverse back in 2E. Well, this book gives us 3 D100 tables on the varying different types of Tieflings. We've got Tiefling abilities, Tiefling appearances, and Tiefling side effects. These tables are fantastic if you want randomized Tiefling PCs. I still use them to this day, but generally I show this page to my players as an example of what Tieflings could be rather than the boring templates that they use for 5e. Then we get some character archetypes. These are kind of like backgrounds from 5e, except they're used for roleplay purposes only with no mechanical benefits. The next section talks about planar kits and proficiencies. Kits back in 2e are kind of like 5e subclasses with 5e backgrounds. It changes your class features and gives you some pros along with some cons. We're given some explanation on how spells work on the planes. This isn't exactly new information, but it is the first time that it's presented to the players. Then as we move towards the end of this book, we're given some new material about belief points. So I previously mentioned how belief shapes the outer planes, but so far it's only been used from a role-playing, world-building, and storytelling standpoint. The belief points brings it into game mechanics, as now the belief points can be used for die rolls and influence the game in other ways. It is somewhat similar to the inspiration mechanics in 5e, as a belief point can be redeemed for a guaranteed success on a die roll, and other benefits. I have incorporated the belief points in the 5e games that I run, and I'll make a future video on using belief points instead of inspiration in 5e. And that's the Planewalkers Handbook, and we can move on to the next one. Next up, let's have a look at the book On Hallowed Ground. This was released in September 1996 and consists of 192 pages. It's quite a thick book. So we've established earlier that gods are real in Planescape and they live mostly on the outer planes. And they're also called powers in Planescape. So this book aims to discuss the role that the powers play in Planescape and their relationship to their followers. So let's have a look at the table of contents. One of the first things that you notice in Planescape is that it loves its P words. So there are primes and planars. Primes refer to anybody who is from the prime material plane. This will be your typical D&D settings like Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk. And planars are used to describe mortals who live on the planes. And then we have priests. Priest is the umbrella term that 2nd edition used to describe player classes that are primarily divine casters. Clerics and druids are both considered priests, but on top of that you also have specialty priests. Specialty priests may describe a cleric who worships a particular deity. They're similar to the subclasses of 5e, except in 2nd edition, different priests had different spheres of magic that they had access to. And spheres of magic have similar concept to wizard spell schools, but for divine casters instead. And then we have proxies, which describes the servant or a vessel of a god. They're typically given additional powers by the god and carry out certain duties across the multiverse. To anybody who played Baldur's Gate 3 or familiar with the Realms lore, the Chosens of Maisha could be considered proxies by Planescape standards. Then we have petitioners. So when a mortal dies, whether they're prime or planar doesn't matter, their soul will go to an outer plane and be reborn as a petitioner. So in a way, the outer planes can be considered the afterlives. And this is why I often call the outer planes the heavens and the hells, as this would be a way a typical mortal would envision the afterlife. So which outer plane would they be assigned to? Typically, if the mortal worshipped a god, they would go to the realm which belongs to the god that they worship on the outer plane. For example, the worshippers of Mystra would arrive in Dwalmahat, which is the name of her realm on Elysium. If they do not worship a certain follower, they will go to the plane which closestly match their alignment. This goes back to my heaven and hell analogy, as the idea being, if you did good things during your lifetime, you end up at one of the upper planes, hence the heavens, and conversely, do bad things during your lifetime, you end up at one of the lower planes, hence the hells. Then it talks about the powers, the gods themselves, then what the factions think about the powers and power-like beings. And then the remainder 3/4 of the book goes on to describe the different powers from different pantheons and also their realm. One thing that Planescape did back in 2nd edition was that it incorporated real-world gods and pantheons into the planes. For example, we have the Greeks, most of whom reside on Arborea, and then the Norse pantheon, the majority of them reside in Isgard. Apart from that, we also have Egyptian, Babylonian, Chinese, Japanese, Finnish, and what they called Indian powers. Now, given this was written back in the 90s, cultural sensitivity was not a priority. So they just kind of lumped together all of the Indian flavored gods, some of them Hindu, some of them Vedic or otherwise. The inclusion of real-world deities in Planescape have always been contentious. Some people may find it ick due to the cultural sensitivity issues that I just talked about. But for me, since I grew up with Saint Seiya manga and anime, and hence I love Greek mythology, and therefore I like the inclusion of real-world deities. And that's the thing. If you're the DM and you don't like something, you can just remove it. It's worth mentioning that the 5e release of Planescape has removed most references to real-world mythology. You'll notice that we also have some new art. To be frank though, I think this art looked like it could be plucked out of any kid's book from the 1970s, and I'm not really a big fan. So we have the coverage on proxies. It mostly talks about how to create NPC proxies. And for player characters who might want to become a proxy, the book pretty much uses all of this space to say don't. Yeah, I don't really know if I agree with that. Petitioners and their purpose in the multiverse gets expanded a little bit, and then the powers are given different levels of strength, more 1970s art for your nerves, and then goes on to talk about power-like beings such as abyssal lords, animal lords, and some of the leaders for some of the other races. And then we move on to the pantheons. As you can see, the amount of space devoted to talking about the concept of the divine pales in comparison to essentially a directory listing of the gods. So for example, the first section we have the Sumerians and the Babylonians. Each god is listed by their portfolio, their alignment, their worshipper's alignment, their holy symbol, where they reside, and this is listed by plane, layer, and realm. And then we're given a proxy for each god, but that's not elaborated upon. And then generally a paragraph or two about that power. But as you can see, this is not a lot to go on. So if I wanted to use a particular power from this book, I will be doing some additional research for myself. So the humanoid pantheons are also contained in this book. We've got the dwarvish pantheon, or also the elvish pantheon. Some of the more popular pantheons are given a map of the realms on the home plane. For example, we have Arvindor, the home of the elves, located in Arborea. So the elves share the plane with the Greeks. Note that elves being elves, they like to use their own names for the plane. So when they say Arvindor, they may be referring to the plane, the layer, or the realm. Let's have a look at the Greek section. This is one of the slightly larger chapters in the book, given how many gods that there are. But not every single one of them are described. And then we also have the map of Olympus, and Asgard gets an entire 2-page spread. So towards the end of the book, we have a chapter on single sphere pantheons. Sphere refers to a crystal sphere, which is a term started in Spelljammer, which refers to individual solar systems. And each solar system is encased in its own physical crystal sphere. They have since removed the crystal spheres concept from the 5e re-release of Spelljammer. So in this case, the planet is Toril, where Faerun is located. So single sphere pantheons refer to gods whose power and influence does not extend beyond that prime-material world. And we have Mystra. As I pointed out previously, that her realm is called Dwalmahat, located on the layer Eronia, which is located on the plane of Elysium. So the point of this book being, if your adventure involves going to one of the gods' realms, you can use this book to flesh it out a bit more. So that's it for this book. Let's move on to the next one. Now for the final supplement released under the Planescape line, called Faces of Evil, the Fiends. This is 96 pages, and it is a monster ecology book. So by this point, the idea of a monster ecology book is not exactly new. Forgotten Realms has received several Alminster's ecologies, and I believe Volo may also have released some ecology books as well. However, this is the first ecology book highlighting the Fiends. Ever since the satanic panic of the 80s, TSR wanted to distance themselves away from the use of devils and demons in their AD&D products. And this is the reason why they changed their names to Beatazu and Tanari respectively. This book was released in September 1997. It's worth noting that Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR in 1998, just a year later. And I heard that one of the first things that they did when they took over was that they wanted to bring back demons and devils. It was a different time, the end of the millennium is almost here, and it seemed like demons and devils were cool again. And let's give this book a flip through. This book aims to cover the main 4 types of fiends. We have the Beatazu, the devils, the Tanari, also known as the demons, the Yugoloth, known as daemons, and the Garaleths, which has recently been reintroduced back into 5e as Demodans, which were their name in 1st edition. And for the last chapter, it covers some fiend-like creatures, but not considered one of those 4 types of fiends. We have the Bodax, Hordlings, Imps Quasits, Larvae, Night Hags, Shadow Fiends, and Tieflings. One thing that all of these creatures have in common is that they're all evil. The introduction chapter talks about the nature of evil and other features of the fiends, such as immortality, as this book attempts to dive into the psychology as much as the ecology. And the Beatazu chapter begins. As they are lawful evil aligned, the book goes into their social structure as well as the hierarchy. We're given a flowchart on how the Beatazu is able to be promoted through the ranks, and what deeds they need to achieve to be considered for promotion. Then it goes over their bodily functions, gender, birth, diet, sleep, and it dives into the summoning process and its relationship with the mortals. And then we have its leaders. We have the Dark Eight, which is in charge of its military operations. And then we have Lords of the Nine, each ruling over a layer of the 9 Hells of Beator. Previously in my Planes of Lore box set showcase video, I talked about how the Beatazu lore was incomplete and it will be superseded in subsequent editions, especially since subsequent editions also introduce new types of devils to the mix and makes the promotion process more murky, but nevertheless it is a fun read. This chapter talks about the same themes except this time for the Tanari and what passes for promotion process for them. And I say that because they're chaotically aligned. What makes this chapter really fun to read though is that each chapter is written by an in-universe author. And this section is written by Zanzos the Slard, who is a fan favorite. There's Zanzos. He's a sensei and he loves to eat, and I think the steam methods are his favorite food. He's a very zany character, also explains why I like Slard so much. Then it goes on to talk about mortal relations, and then its leaders under the heading of Abyssal Lords. I've noticed some of the most famous Abyssal Lords are not covered in this section, such as Pazuzu, Jubilex, and Demogorgon. I think it's because those lords already received a decent amount of write-up previously, and this book wanted to introduce some new or obscure lords into the mix. The next chapter we have the Yugoloths. As this book is released after Hellbound the Blood War box set, and the Yugoloths received a lot of lore expansion in that module, so all of their new lore has been included in this book. This piece of artwork is from that box set, which depicts the Arcana Loth with 2 marionettes, one of them a Beatazu, one of them a Tanari. I'm sure you don't need me to connect the dots for you on this one. The next chapter talks about the Garaleths. They're aligned with chaotic evil and their home plane is Kasiri. Arpoms is considered their creator and leader. There are only 3 types of Garaleth that exist, called the Farastu, the Kaluba, and the Shator. This chapter is really interesting because it's the first time that we received anything on Garaleth society and ecology. However, it's only 5 pages long. And the last chapter finishes this book off by addressing the remaining fiend-like creatures, like Bodax and Night Hags, but each creature only gets about a page or 2 worth of write-up. And that is pretty much it for this book. Hey, thanks for staying to the end of the video. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I've got more content coming, so until next time, hope we get to hang out again in my next video.